Hello. I wanted to make this video today to talk about why I still believe in carbon offsets. I am one of the biggest critics in the industry, and yet I still really passionately believe that carbon offsets are one of the best solutions that we have to climate change. So maybe start with why I chose to make this video now. There's a bunch of reasons, but I think the most important is that what I've observed over the last couple of months is a shift in the narrative around people talking about carbon offsets that I think has been a little toxic. Whereas before, people would often talk about carbon offsets and criticize them for this project being bad, or this program or project type being bad, or these credits being bad. Now I'm starting to see people just say offsetting itself is bad. Offsetting itself is a dangerous distraction. Offsetting itself can never work. It's intractably broken. And while the two types of criticism may seem similar to those in the carbon markets, both of them are attacks on their work, they are really fundamentally different because one of them is a chance to improve. When you write a paper or write an article saying 95% of REDD Plus carbon projects aren't any good because their baselines are broken, that is an opportunity to improve the REDD Plus program. On the other hand, when you write an article that says carbon credits can never work, carbon credits are intractably broken, what you're doing there is giving up on the whole concept. And there's a lot of reasons why that's problematic. But I think top of my list is that giving up on carbon credits is usually means giving up on climate change in general. Because generally speaking, people abandon offsetting in favor of just apathy. So I want to get into the details here, and maybe I'll start with the primary driver of this video, which was a recent Science article. And it was a review paper of a lot of different other papers, which had basically looked at the last 25 years of offsetting and concluded that given the last 25 years of offsetting has mostly not worked, carbon credits can never work. And it kind of concluded that carbon credits are intractably broken. So this obviously made news. The Guardian covered this news article. I had a lot of issues with this paper. And my first issue starts with the language itself, intractably broken. I don't think that's particularly scientific language. And I think it's really quite irresponsible to be using language like that unless you have really firm data to back it up. Now, this is very hypocritical of Elias, right? Like, I make these YouTube videos where I rant and rave, sometimes wearing a wizard's hat, about people's, offsets. But I do want to make the distinction between a YouTube channel, which is half comedic in nature, and a scientific paper, which, people inherently take seriously. And I have to say, I would not have typically been allowed to use that type of language in the scientific papers that I have published in the past. My problems with that paper don't stop with the language, though. The paper dwelled on a lot of problems that don't really affect carbon offsets very often. That included things like double counting. Like, that's not a real problem that really has happened very much in the carbon offset world. The paper treated every carbon credit as if it were an independent sample. But really, like, when you're looking at the last 25 years of carbon offsetting, what you're looking at are two big pushes. You're looking at the Clean Development Mechanism, which was developed out of the Kyoto Protocol, which didn't work very well. And you're looking at, like, Verra's program, the Verified Carbon Standard, which also didn't work very well. What's my point here? Well, it's really, rather than like thousands of little attempts to do carbon credits, it's really kind of been two big pushes. And if you kind of break it out by those who are creating the credits, you get much more of a mixed bag. Where, like, okay, the CDM created bad credits, Verra created bad credits. Well, Gold Standard hasn't created as many bad credits. But, my other big point about this paper is, what if we just flip the script? What if we ask, over the past 25 years of trying to reduce emissions, has that been successful? And the answer, frankly, is no. 25 years of evidence of, emissions reductions has proven pretty well that we're not good at reducing our own emissions as a society. Does that mean that it's intractably broken? Does that mean that we should never try to reduce our emissions at all? That we should just give up on it because it's politically unviable and because, like, people cheat on these, like, attempts to reduce their emissions? No, obviously not. All right, but what's important here is that this is not a review of that paper. And I want to get to my first point of why I do believe in carbon offsets, which is inherently negative. Which is that I don't think there are many alternatives for dealing with climate change. I think that people who often criticize carbon offsets paint a false dichotomy where they say, well, you should stop offsetting and instead reduce your emissions. The reality is that there's only so much emissions reductions that we can realistically do. Any company or individual usually has some amount of wiggle room with emissions reductions that are maybe easy. Like maybe it is easy for you to reduce like 30 to 50% of your emissions. But then you usually hit a wall, and then it gets hard. As an example, I drive an electric car. I pay for that extra little bit of like my home electricity to come from renewables. But I have a pretty big carbon footprint because I do fly all over the place for work. You probably have to also. But even more importantly, like as an individual, I'm not willing to make severe sacrifices to my lifestyle. I still fly places recreationally. I still eat meat. I still motorcycle around. And it seems like this is an important point because the technology level that we're at right now in society is still at a point where we'd have to make pretty major life sacrifices to do away with most of our emissions. And most people don't seem willing to make those sacrifices. And that includes people who are pretty far to the political left, never mind those who just don't believe in climate change at all. So my point is that this is a real false dichotomy between like offsetting versus like reducing your emissions. The reality is that we're talking about either buying offsets or doing nothing about your emissions. We should take a second here to think about all of the companies that have quit offsetting in the last 3 years due to the scandals. And we can think of quite a few of them. Of those companies that have quit offsetting, how many of them are actually doing something better in place of offsetting? Yeah, okay, the offsets they were buying mostly didn't work. Probably they should have put more effort into buying good ones, but they're not reducing their emissions in place of that. Instead, they're just doing nothing at all. So I really want to hammer home the point here that offsetting really needs to work right now in order for us to tackle climate change at scale, because we don't have many other options. But my next point is maybe more optimistic and much more technical, which is that asking everybody to reduce their emissions individually, be it individuals or companies, is inherently economically inefficient. In fact, it's difficult to do and we shouldn't necessarily expect it. What we're essentially asking right now is for every company to go around and reduce their emissions down to nothing on their own. We're asking accountants, we're asking toy makers, we're asking automotive manufacturers, all to become climate experts to figure out how they can take their emissions from like 100% down to nothing. That is not an efficient way to run an economy or to achieve things at scale. For 100 plus years now, what we've recognized is better is to have companies that specialize in their field, and in this case, have companies that specialize in mass carbon removal and have them do that instead of have every single person like do it on their own. Here's an analogy. Should we expect Ford Motor Company to manufacture every single piece that goes into their car on site? Or should we have a company that is just good at making tires that Ford can buy the tires from? So let's bring it back to offsetting then. Does it make sense to ask everyone to build like an individual little wind turbine in their backyard? Or does it make sense to have like one big company place a giant wind turbine on top of a mountain where it's more efficient to turn the turbine? Ideally, governments could do this type of collective action for us, but if we're being honest, they're not. And maybe they're not good at that in the context of climate change because climate change is a problem that, involves long-term thinking and governments can't seem to do that. But the thing is, carbon offsets do offer that economic alternative. They offer the ability for someone to pay a company that is really, really good at removing gigatons and gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to do it efficiently and at scale instead of them having to figure out how to do it themselves. So here I want to think of one last analogy here, which is that carbon credits are a lot like banking. Maybe the banking industry is full of crooks, but we still need them, and we can't expect everyone to act as their own bank. The next big point that I want to make is to kind of tackle this myth that offsetting itself is harmful. For example, I watched a PBS video recently that's called offsetting a dangerous distraction. I think this is pretty thoroughly debunkable, and I think it has been debunked by science already. So I want to take a look at a recent paper in 2025 by Stoltz and Probst, in which they analyzed 89 large companies. And one of the things that they found was that there were no difference between emissions of companies that offset and those that didn't offset. Now, there's a lot of conclusions that you can draw from this type of data, but one of them is that offsets themselves are not encouraging people to pollute more. Companies that bought offsets, they were not polluting more because they bought offsets. It's not as if they had just given themselves permission to turn on the gas. Now, The paper did note that there was one exception, which was airlines. And in these cases, airlines had bought offsets and actually taken money out of their R&D for sustainable fuel research. Now, the paper made a big fuss about this. And part of the reason they made a big fuss about this, I think, is that Probst himself, as a scientist, he's very anti-offsetting. So the fact that this was the only exception that they could glean out of the data says something about it. But airlines themselves, I don't know that that's a good analogy, because airlines are part of a quasi-compliance system called CORSIA, where they have to do something to reduce their emissions. And so maybe this paper does show that, like, a glimmer of evidence that in compliance markets, people might buy offsets instead of doing the right thing. But that is only the case for these airlines, and it's only the case if you believe that sustainable jet fuel is like a valid alternative to dealing with climate change. But here's the other little takeaway that you can get from this paper, which is that offsets themselves, they may not be encouraging people to pollute more, but they're also not encouraging people to reduce their emissions. And this is unfortunate, because I think offsets could actually be used to encourage people to reduce their emissions. And I think personally the reason that they're not right now is that they just don't sell for enough money. I think if offsets sold for like 30, 50, 80 bucks a ton, or maybe even more, then we'd see a world in which people really didn't want to buy these things, and instead kind of forced to look at more painful attempts at reducing their emissions, things that might actually bite into the bottom line. So again, I would put this problem with offsets, the idea that they're not actually causing people to reduce their emissions, on the idea that offsets themselves are still kind of broken, and bad ones have been created, and they've been able to sell for like below the actual cost of doing the offsetting. But here's my biggest takeaway from this paper, which is that companies that quit offsetting and just walk away from it have ultimately worse climate outcomes than companies that don't quit offsetting. As this paper shows, the emissions of those who offset and those who don't offset are equal. And if we just think back at all the companies that have kind of walked away from the idea, we can't really think of anything that these companies are doing to make up for the fact that they're not buying offsets. And so, even in a world in which 75% of the offsets that they were buying were bad, they were still doing more by buying them than not buying them. Let me move on to my next point, which is that the science of offsetting is fine. The science is actually really good. Just like a bank, where you can have one person put $1 into a bank on one side of the country and another person take $1 out of the bank on another side of the country, there's no, atmospheric reason that you can't have one person put CO2 in one place and one person take out CO2 in another place. Carbon dioxide dissolves into the atmosphere incredibly fast. And within a matter of months, carbon dioxide, any ton of carbon that you put into the atmosphere has spread across the entire Earth. So anywhere on Earth that you're pulling carbon dioxide out has a benefit that impacts the rest of the Earth. So the idea of offsetting is fine. And the other thing I want to point out is that the project types that people have proposed for offsetting are also fine. All types of carbon projects do work, at least in theory, at removing carbon offsets. That includes the giant CO2 vacuum cleaners, that includes trees, that even includes cook stoves. But let's focus on trees, because I obviously am a tree guy. Deforestation itself accounts for 11 to 16% of human emissions. So there's no doubt that trees need to play a huge role in dealing with climate change. But how are we going to stop that without offsets? Where is the mechanism for funding going to come from for stopping deforestation if not offsets? Because I gotta say, the international, treaty negotiations around these things, also haven't been particularly successful. The other important point about trees is that they do obviously remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They are made of primarily carbon. Trees, they die, as we all know. They get old and they die, they catch fire and they die, but forests remain intact. And there are forests that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. The Amazon rainforest has been storing 100 gigatons of carbon since the dinosaurs. While trees themselves may be temporary, if we're genuinely serious about using forests to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, there's no reason that's not a really viable solution that can last for a really long time. It's certainly reasonable to criticize particular carbon projects for not being long enough or for being particularly risky, but what that really means is that we need to fix these project types. Maybe it even means that we shouldn't be doing carbon offsetting in places that are in severe climate decline, like Eastern Oregon. But it doesn't mean that we can't use trees on the whole. Here's an important point that I need to make. Even though carbon credits, on average, haven't worked out that well, hidden in that stat are still hundreds of carbon projects that are working really, really well. Even if 75% of carbon credits are not doing well, we've made so many of them that still leaves hundreds of millions of tons of carbon that has successfully been removed from the climate. It still leaves over 100 carbon projects, if not more, that are really, really good. And so what I want to do for a moment in this video is go over them and talk about some of these astounding successes that I have seen in the carbon markets. Let's start with Gola. Gola is a REDD+ carbon project in Sierra Leone. Thanks to this project, deforestation has ground to a halt. And this little pocket of rainforest is like one of the last remaining kind of intact forests in West Africa now. The World International Foundation's mangrove program restores mangroves primarily in Southeast Asia. It's been wildly successful, and it's been really clear that these mangroves have removed a lot more carbon from the atmosphere than they're credited for. The Passamaquoddy Improved Forest Management Project in the United States. The Passamaquoddy tribe is a Native American tribe that had to wrestle back a bunch of its land in the 1980s and 90s. They probably didn't get back as much land as they should have. But, after that time, because this is a fairly impoverished tribe, they really had to cut their forest hard because this was the only source of revenue that these tribe members had. This carbon project has given them an option to manage their forests much more sustainably, and the regeneration that we observe on their forests is really tangible. Another project to highlight is Garcia River. This is one of a number of projects operated by the Conservation Fund in which they've gone around and bought up land and improved the forest management on that land. So they still are operating it for timber, and they're letting these kind of mature redwood areas that are really rare on the California coast grow back. It's still additional because the Conservation Fund is only able to buy this land thanks to the carbon program. Chestnut Carbon is another group that goes and buys land specifically to plant trees. And they go around, mostly in the United States, and they buy up land that's kind of really marginal agriculture, land that's been fallow, land that people aren't using, like on a floodplain or something, and they restore forests on that land. Living Carbon is a company that specializes in minefield remediation. In Appalachia, we've been removing entire mountaintops for coal, bringing mountains down to just bare earth. And it will take hundreds of years for those forests to recover. Living Carbon is going in and bootstrapping that process by planting trees that are really good at thriving in these bare earth environments and restoring forests in dozens of years instead of hundreds. The Nature Conservancy has a similar program in their Cumberland mine remediation program. Landlife is a project developer that works in the United States and in Europe to plant native trees on kind of marginal agricultural land. Mass is an interesting company that is looking to prevent forest fires by thinning out ladder fuels and then taking that wood that they thinned out and burying it. And this is a really good way of storing carbon for thousands of years and also reducing the likelihood of fire. Manoa is one of my favorite REDD+ projects. This is a project in Brazil that has been almost entirely deforested on all sides at this point. When it started back, I think in 2015, there was just a little bit of deforestation to the south. Today, there is deforestation around the entire project area, and I have no doubt without this project, the whole area would have gone up in flames and cattle farms. Nika Forest is a small project developer that works in Nicaragua. They go around planting a combination of native and commercial trees on very small farms. It's very clear that no one else in Nicaragua is planting trees for any other reason, so it's highly additional. Revalue is a pretty new project developer. They're trying to reinvent how we think of REDD+ projects. They're using all kinds of fancy technology, and a lot of it is kind of marketing schmush. But still, they're doing REDD+ projects in a really positive way, and they're also planting a ton of mangroves. The TIST program is my personal favorite carbon project of all time. They've got over 260,000 small farmers in Uganda, Kenya, India, and they're paying these deeply impoverished small farmers to plant trees around the edges of their farms. They've been enormously successful, and literally the nation of Uganda is visibly greener from space thanks to this program. Bauminvest is a German project developer that works primarily in Latin America, Colombia, and maybe Panama as well. They plant, a combination of native and commercial species. Again, this is a situation where it's clear that there's no other reason to be planting these trees if not for these credits. And then I shouldn't leave out the dozens of projects in Mexico under the Climate Action Reserve's Mexican program that are taking areas that belong to Mexican ejidos, that it is kind of like traditional native land, and improving the forest management and giving carbon credits for tree growth that takes place in these historically degraded areas. Now, not every project in this program is perfect, but there are dozens that really are perfect. At the same time, though, a lot of people in the carbon industry would have us sugarcoat the problem. They would say, carbon credits are fixed, it's VCM 2.0, we're done, everything's good now. That's not the case. Many offsets are good, but most coming off the presses are still bad. But why does this happen? The simple answer is corruption. It's happening because of corruption. There are two types of corruption in the carbon markets. The first is kind of operational corruption. And this is the type of corruption that you're going to encounter whenever you're working in some of like the most tricky places on Earth. Places like dictatorships, places where illegal logging happens all the time. If you want to stop deforestation in Cambodia, you've got to get your hands dirty. And listen, I mean, that is kind of inherent to the program. But here's the good news. If you don't want to deal with Cambodian corruption, you don't have to. Don't buy those credits. Just avoid them. You know, these are kind of the high-risk, high-reward types of carbon programs that we still need to kind of give a try to, but they don't need to define carbon offsets. You can still buy really safe carbon credits in places that aren't corrupt. But there's a second type of carbon corruption, which is that the market itself has historically been pretty corrupt. I think it still is pretty corrupt. Large registries have created a lot of bad offsets, and even after really rigorous scientific proof, they still defend those offsets and they still create more. It's primarily Verra and the American Carbon Registry that I'm talking about here. Those registries, they've created conflicts of interest, like hiring your own auditors, allowing project developers to sit on like Verra's board of directors, maintaining close relationships with project developers, acting kind of like inappropriately in those relationships. And then finally, project developers themselves, certainly some of them probably created credits that they knew weren't actually offsetting carbon. And, they used convoluted modeling and convoluted math to wring as many carbon credits as possible out of these projects. We can't brush this under the rug. And it is fair game for reporters and scientists to critique this, because this is the only way it's going to get fixed. We owe those reporters like Patrick Greenfield, Ben Elgin, scientists like Thales West, a real debt of gratitude for helping clean up our space. But here's the good news. Corruption can be fixed. And generally speaking, corruption is fixed in three big ways. The first way is in regulation. And now we may look at like the current political situation and think like regulation is hopeless. The carbon markets are never going to be regulated. But that's really not the case. There are some like bright points on the horizon. The CFTC has launched investigations into bad offsets in the United States. People have been arrested for that. That's a real strong mechanism to make people behave better. The nation of Brazil has really cracked down on bad carbon credits. They've arrested a bunch of people in their country too. California has tried at several points to create legislation that would make project developers and registries responsible for those bad credits that they create. And, that bill hasn't passed yet, but there's no reason to believe that, like, something like that couldn't pass in the future. And it's easy to believe that, like, the EU could pass some sort of, like, regulations around what constitutes, like, quality in the voluntary carbon markets. The second way that you can combat corruption is litigation. Companies that have bought bad carbon offsets should sue. This is a really important mechanism for combating fraud in, like, a free market. And I'm kind of surprised that they haven't sued yet, and I think the reason for that is that offsets are really tied to PR, and no company wants to kind of take that on. But I think this is a really important way to kind of make everyone in the market behave. Like, people should be financially responsible for the carbon credits that they put out, and being responsible like that will make them inherently more conservative about the credits they create. But the third way of dealing with corruption is really what I'm seeing a lot of in the carbon markets right now, which is market mechanisms. You see, it's almost impossible right now to sell bad carbon credits. In fact, it's almost impossible to sell good carbon credits right now. The markets have been so thoroughly shaken that the handful of people remaining in the markets today are extremely picky about what carbon credits they buy. And so even if you're trying to create credits from like a bad old REDD+ project that was registered under Verra as like VM15, you're not going to be able to sell them. And so we really kind of have a solution right here that has done a huge amount to improving the quality of the carbon markets today. Buyers have revolted and formed their own buying blocks with better standards than the methodologies themselves. The Symbiosis Coalition is the most known, but companies at large are like globally creating their own standards for what they'll accept when they buy offsets. Microsoft, the Symbiosis Coalition, Frontier, these are all attempts to like really improve the markets. Like almost impossible to sell bad offsets. And I have to be honest, like finding good credits has never been easier than before. Like there are tons of people who have like started in this industry as a result of like the bad offsets that they saw and are really trying to change things. There are new registries out there that are trying to compete with like the bad ones. That includes like Isometric, Equitable Earth, Social Carbon, Open Forest Protocol, and it even includes some of the older ones that we don't associate with scandals, like Gold Standard and the Climate Action Reserve. These new registries have tackled the conflicts of interest that were inherent to the old systems. So if you're a project developer under Isometric, you can't create your own carbon baselines. You can't create your own leakage numbers. You can't hire your own auditor. Isometric assigns you an auditor, and you can't pay that auditor. That auditor is paid through like third-party means, and like they have different ways of doing it. But essentially, like as a project developer, I'm not able to hire my own like audit anymore. Now, I mean, these problems haven't been fixed on Vera's system, but like these other systems are clearly much better. And the other half of that coin is that there are dozens of new project developers that are really trying to do things right. And I listed a bunch of them before: Revalue, Chestnut, Living Carbon. Ideally my own company, because I am now developing carbon credits, and we're really, really trying to do it right. So I think it's really easy to find good credits on the market in a way that wasn't the case 5 years ago, where you couldn't really tell if someone was doing it right or doing it wrong. And one of the reasons for that is that after all these revelations, there's no more blind trust in the markets. We're in this spot now where we have like multiple means of validating our assumptions about these carbon credits, and that really results in really good carbon credits coming to light. I have to say, like, some of the bad players who have been on the markets and like caused this situation in the first place, they're really suffering. Like, financially speaking, it's very clear they're like doing layoffs and stuff. So like the market kind of is correcting itself. To go back to our banking analogy, like you still have to be careful about where you put your money in like the financial markets. And it's very clear now to anyone buying carbon credits, you have to be a little careful about where you buy your carbon credits for too. Now, the carbon methodologies I often rail about. I have to get very upset about like new carbon methodologies that aren't good enough. And to be clear, new carbon methodologies coming out of Vera and the American Carbon Registry aren't good enough. They still have problems. But they have fewer problems. And I know this is kind of cold comfort, but if we're being honest, the level of manipulation that occurred like 5-10 years ago is almost inconceivable today. Like the methodologies, they still allow for way too much manipulation, from Vera and ACR that is. But like I have a really hard time believing we could end up in a situation where like a scientist writes that 94% of offsets are bad. But let's move on to like another fairly important point, which is that carbon offsetting is often about more than just carbon. And I don't think I need to dwell on this because everyone knows this, but offsets almost always come with co-benefits that are really beneficial to the environment, like environmental restoration, poverty alleviation, green energy, money for disenfranchised people in the global south. And, I have to say, like, these co-benefits, they have the same track record as the offsets themselves. Like, there are lots of situations in the carbon markets where human rights violations have occurred, land deprivation, colonialism. I mean, at the end of the day, a carbon credit is usually like you telling someone they can't do something with their land in exchange for money, and that amount of money better be a fair compensation. But at the same time, just like carbon offsets themselves, we can point to dozens, if not hundreds, of projects in which these co-benefits have really worked well. We can point to like Pakistani mangrove restoration, where like for the first time in decades, fish populations are on the rise, and local fishing villages are really benefiting from that. We can point to Native American communities that were treated unfairly for hundreds of years that are finally able to like make money off their land without exploiting it. These successes can be expanded upon. We just need to learn from what makes them a success and then kind of replicate them. And, I think people often point to like other avenues for funding this type of work, like biodiversity credits or like direct contribution programs, which are basically like a company like sponsoring some sort of positive environmental work. But I have to be honest, I don't see the same level of like scalability and accountability that I do in the carbon markets. Like with biodiversity credits, you're kind of attempting to quantify the unquantifiable, and you're kind of putting like a number on ecosystems that I'm very uncomfortable with. And, with direct contribution models, they don't really clearly tie back to accountability. If you dump 10 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere, under carbon crediting schemes, you got to do something about that. That equals 10 million tons. If you donate $10 million to an environmental project, I'm not really sure how that ties back to the harm that your operations might have caused to the ecosystem. So I still think carbon credits are a really important way of kind of tying people down to commitments. Even if the naysayers about carbon offsets are right, and you could maybe like snap your fingers and reduce your emissions, we'd still kind of be losing an important mechanism here. And I think that's worth dwelling on for a moment. I'm not saying that you shouldn't reduce your emissions instead of buying offsets, but like offsets have these other nice things about them that could work. All right, so where does that leave us? Let's talk about a path forward here. Given the massive variety of outcomes that I've observed, like reviewing hundreds of projects in my career, I don't think it's reasonable for us to just abandon the premise. I've seen so many good projects that we can't give up on it. But at the same time, we stand at an inflection point in the carbon markets, and if we're going to have like a positive path forward, and if we're going to make these markets kind of rebound, it requires a lot of coordination and a lot of like tough work. Buyers are doing the best so far, and they need to continue demanding high quality, doing a lot of diligence, and setting their own standards. So they're doing great there. Developers and registries need to craft new generations of projects and new generations of methodologies, but they also need to be really honest about themselves and have an open scientific dialogue about the reality of their old credits. And that may look like them saying, hey, half the credits we issued in the past don't seem to have done what we thought they did. We are copping to that. And scientists and reporters have a role to play in this too, because they should still keep us on our toes. They should still be investigating bad projects and bringing those to light. But at the same time, we should probably focus on what makes carbon credits work. I want to know where the review paper is of great projects. Like, what scientifically has gone into making these successes when we can find these successes? Like, let's take like the top-rated projects off the rating platforms and do a review of those. And here's the thing, we all need to be a little brave with our careers here, because we didn't get into this job for job security, Lord no, or for cash. And I recognize that there are some really cynical people out there who probably did get into this for cash. But the majority of us in the carbon markets are here because we want to make a difference in climate change, and that means speaking out. So, we've had hundreds of successful carbon projects to date, and they've really proven that this concept can work. But we really need to double down, figure out what's making those work, and figure out how to expand those successes. At the same time, we need to be realistic about what we see when we see it.